Hi class, and welcome to your highlights video for chapter 1, where we are talking about the science of psychology. Again, I just cover a few highlights of the chapter. I leave it to you to read the chapter to yourself, and I don't read it to you. I don't cover the whole thing. So towards the end, like if you have any questions that are still remaining that you want some clarification about, that's what you want to put on the chapter Q&A discussion board. For our video, we're going to highlight the features and the goals of science, the ways we acquire knowledge, and highlight some specific flaws in thinking or heuristics that we use when we are acquiring knowledge. So we'll get started. The main features of science that your textbook brings up are these three: systematic empiricism, being concerned with empirical questions, and creating public knowledge. So this would be using a standardized approach to observe, make up observations and test those observations. Being concerned with empirical questions has to do with looking at the things in the here and now, not just, oh, I wonder if this might happen in some place, It has to be something that we can test and potentially falsify, like today, not theoretically. And then creating public knowledge reaches into making our findings accessible to everyone and putting our findings out there to our peers for critical evaluation on what we've done and what we've found, so that the knowledge that is generated has been proofed. Some of the goals of science that the chapter talks about are in describing, predicting, and explaining. And then I included one that is also brought up. I call it influence, but I've seen it called control, change, or modify behavior. So back up to the top there, describe, that's gathering behavioral information through observations in efforts to understand what is presently going on, to understand human behavior and describe it. Predict is to anticipate the occurrence of specific behaviors. So if I know that one certain condition or situation is always related to a subsequent condition or situation, then I'm able to predict when another occurrence might happen. Not that it's causing it, just that it happens to happen together. And then explaining, that's where they're getting into causal relationships, explaining why people behave as they do. And that goes into, we'll get more into it with the experimental research chapter, where we're looking at causal relationships, what causes behavior to happen, what predicts it in a way where it creates that behavior. And then influence, again, if I can control behavior, like make it not occur, or change behavior so that when these factors are in place, it facilitates a behavior. Those are in that influence or change behavior space. Very typical of psychoanalysis or therapy, any kind of where we want to change our behaviors. And I left you a nice little link to a page from Very Well Mind in the Canvas resources that are really interesting on looking at these 4 goals of science. Next, we have the acquisition of knowledge, or the methods that we acquire knowledge. And your text brought up a few. Intuition, right? Just having a feeling or a sense of what's going on. Authority, when we get our knowledge from someone else, like a book or a teacher or our parents. Rationalism is using logic. Well, if this is true, then that is true. Empiricism refers to observations and watching the things around us. And then scientific method, which we'll go into more detail in chapter 2, is where we use a systematic or standardized process to our observations so that we can actually test what we're seeing in the now and deciding how true it is, testing it to see if it still holds up in other conditions. And then this leads us into ways that we have flaws in thinking or biases that creep in. And a lot of times you'll see this called as heuristics, which means shortcuts. Very typical of intuition. We use a lot of heuristic or shortcuts when we're trying to gauge a situation quickly. We're trying to determine really fast if this is a safe situation for me to be in or not. And we don't really have time to test every potential condition out. We need to know like now. So these are different types of heuristics that can create flaws in how we come to decisions. The first one we have here is the availability heuristic. And that's when we judge a situation based on how often we're hearing about it. In other words, it might not actually happen that often, but we hear about it more often. Think about like the media. Another one is called the representativeness heuristic, which is judging a situation based on the similarity of an object or person to what we think it should be, what it represents, right? So I have here some persons. Who do you think went to Harvard? We have the former mayor of Pensacola, Hayward Ashton. We have the current mayor of Pensacola, Grover Robinson. And we have swimsuit model, Sonia Dara. What do you think? Which one of these went to Harvard? Well, you can probably guess that it's a trick question. So the former mayor went to Florida State University, got his bachelor's. The current mayor went to Birmingham Southern College, and the swimsuit model went to Harvard and studied economics. Wow. And you thought psychology was hard. So that's one thing that we do, like a shortcut where we see something and we think, hey, is this representative of someone who went to Harvard? It's very easy for us to assume some guy in a suit and tie went to Harvard, but a knockout model did not, right? So it's ways where we make shortcuts and jump to conclusions that might not be true. Some others are the overconfidence bias, which is a tendency to be overly confident in the correctness of our own judgment, or the better than average kind of bias, a tendency to overestimate our own skills or our performance when comparing ourselves to others. The confirmation bias, when we seem to only be finding evidence of what we already believe, but in some ways that's the evidence that we selectively target and focus in on when there are other explanations, but it takes work to actually look for the things that would disprove what we already believe. Another one is hindsight bias. When, man, I knew that was going to happen. Not likely. Probably just hindsight bias. It seems like I would have known that it would happen now that I'm looking back at it. And another one here called focusing. This is when we focus on the pieces that are close to us and undervalue things that are not as proximal. So very similar to confirmation bias there, but it's not that we are not even seeing the other pieces, but we're really focused on the pieces that are close to us. And a last one called belief perseverance. This is when we maintain a belief despite encountering contradictory information. So it would be like believing that the moon landing was a hoax. This would be really believing that thing, that it didn't happen, when there's so much information, so much contradictory information saying that yes, it really did happen. So with all of these biases that can impact both our judgments and impact research and scientific inquiry, is there a place for intuition at all? Well, yes, definitely. Our intuition is it's picking up on things that are nonverbal, and it can be highly efficient. Like I said, sometimes we need to judge a situation very quickly, and we can't run a whole 3-part test to figure out if I'm in a safe place or not, right? So we have to rely on our intuition. But then later we can look back and say, what was it that I was picking up on? And then when you can think about it more systematically, you might be able to find things that you could test. So intuition a lot of times can lead us to very interesting research questions. The thing we have to be mindful of is that we naturally get too strongly attached to our intuitive beliefs. So we need to make sure that we're aware of our biases and pay attention to them when we are planning a research design. I also put a little link for intuition and talking about it in more details in our Canvas page. Speaking of Canvas, I wanted to show you how that chapter page looks. We have our overview tab, which contains our learning outcomes for that particular week, and a general strategy or approach to staying on top of the learning for that week's material. In the resources tab is where you're going to find this video and also any other resources that I have for you for the topic this week. And then the deliverables tab contains the reminder checklist of items to submit with links to where you would submit your assignments in Canvas. So let's take a look at that real quick. So here's our chapter page for chapter 1. Again, the overview gives us the learning outcomes. It has the just general strategy that I would say for helping you complete the tasks and the learning objectives for each week. In the resources, here's where the lecture video will be linked, and the extra items that I thought you might find interesting that are related to our information for this chapter. And then in deliverables for this week, we just have the chapter Q&A discussion board. Again, what I want you to put there is after you've read the chapter, what other questions are still like you're unsure about in the chapter. And if you don't have any questions, you can try answering one of your classmates' questions. And you have your chapter 1 quiz. And that is it for today. And hope you enjoyed your quick little highlights video of chapter 1. I'll see you in the next video.